Okay. Welcome, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. My name is Stephen Sas, and I'm here near New York City in my home as part of the Buddhist Association of the United States, Chuanyen Monastery in Carmel, New York, and the Wuju Memorial Library. And we're very pleased to present to you an online Pali summer intensive class. I think this might be one of the very first attempts to teach a large-scale, fully online Pali language class. So it's a somewhat experimental endeavor, and I certainly hope it works out well for all of us. I have taught elementary Pali several times, but it is a little challenging to do it to a screen and not to a room of human beings. And so we'll see how that works out, because I do understand how important it is for students to be able to practice their speaking, pronunciation, and all those things and interact with each other. But unfortunately, right now in the age of the COVID-19 virus, we're unable to do that. But it does present us with a very special and exciting opportunity to do such a thing like this. And I'm joined here with my colleague Kaiti, who is the wonderful librarian of the Wuju Memorial Library in Carmel, New York, Chuanyen Monastery. As I mentioned, my name is Stephen Sas. I am a Pali student of Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, who I'm sure needs no introduction. He is one of the most foremost translators and scholars of Pali Buddhism, sometimes called Theravadan Buddhism. He has numerous translations as well as publications on the Pali Canon. And in many ways, I would say personally, his translations are sort of the gold standard of English translation. They are incredibly reliable. They also are furnished with a wonderful critical apparatus, which includes much of the commentary to help us understand the words of the Buddha as we find them in the Pali Canon. And we're going to talk a bit about what the Pali Canon is. And so you probably, or you perhaps saw Venerable Bodhi's Facebook post about this class. And in this post, he mentioned that the Pali Canon is the most complete collection of the Buddha's teaching. This is everything we know in this canon. There, of course, are other collections of the Buddha's teaching in other languages. There are, as you might know, a collection called the Agama, which are in Chinese, and there are some in other languages as well. But the most complete collection of these ancient texts are in Pali. And so I want to talk a little bit first, before we launch into the language itself, how to learn it, to ask the question, or maybe address the question, what is Pali? What is this language? And I want to put it out in just very quick, broad strokes, because this is not a comparative language class, and this is not a philosophy class. But I think it is important to talk a little bit briefly about the language that we're here to learn, and to talk a little bit about what it is. And so perhaps one of the most important things to know about the word Pali is that it is not actually the name of a language, but the word Pali, in Pali, means text. And so it's the text of the canon. And it's part of it's generally considered to be part of what's called the Indo-European group of languages. And I'm going to now share my screen and show you a few slides about this. And I'm going to present to you perhaps a couple of ideas about what Pali is. And I should maybe say that I am not an expert in this field. I am really just presenting various thoughts that much more important experts have presented. And so I'm sort of reporting what people have said. And I'm not really taking sides. So let me share my screen. And of course, we have this wonderful slide. I hope you can see. Oop. But that's not what I'm looking for at this exact moment. What I wanted to first call up is this language tree. And I hope this is not too small for you, but this diagram was actually created by a friend of mine named Jack Lynch. I don't take credit for this diagram. And what it talks about is what's known as the Proto-Indo-European family of languages. And there's sort of a surprisingly large number and diversity of them. Scholars today are debating where this language originated and who exactly spoke it. It's not a language that we have records of, because like so many early languages, like for instance, Pali, it was an entirely oral language. There was no writing. There was no writing at the time of the Buddha. And so we don't have written records, and so we don't really know what Proto-Indo-European looked like exactly. We don't have books, so to speak, in that language. But very qualified linguists have done a lot of analysis for quite a while, trying to sort of reconstruct or trace back different languages that are in this family. And so at the top here, you can see several large groups that you all recognize. The Italic, that's most famously known as the Latin languages or the Romance languages. And as we go down, we see the languages in bold, such as Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and of course we have Hellenic, which is the Greek languages, and we have the Germanic languages, in which we can trace perhaps straight down the middle into modern English, although we know that English is actually composed of both Germanic and Latin roots. And then perhaps most relevant to this class, we have what is known as the Indo-Iranian group of languages, perhaps most famously Sanskrit, which is something that Pali students always sort of have in the room with them, because Pali and Sanskrit are very, very closely related. And of course, this is related to the modern day Indian languages, Hindi, Marathi, etc. And there's more and more that we maybe didn't realize are all together in this big family: Polish, Ukrainian, Russian. And so Pali would fall somewhere right below Sanskrit. And we're going to talk briefly about the relationship between Sanskrit and Pali and how these languages rather, are closely related. And I have this quick slide to show you. And I'm sorry that perhaps for us, the most important thing is in this smaller inset on the right, but all these languages that are in different colors as opposed to gray are part of this family, including Russia, as you can see, and the Scandinavian languages. And then here, sort of at the lower right, Iran. And then maybe I can make a little bigger, the northern Indian languages as well. So that is the Indic family. Oh, this is, no. And so the question is, the relationship between Sanskrit and Pali is somewhat debated. And the question is, where did Pali come from? And in what sense Pali is a language? And perhaps the most orthodox view about Pali is that, well, the Pali, or the language that we call today Pali, but it doesn't seem to be the language, it doesn't seem to be the name the language was called at the time of the Buddha, is actually just the language the Buddha spoke. He spoke Pali. People listened to him that also spoke Pali, and the texts were recorded in Pali. And of course, it's important to note that this was all entirely an oral tradition, that this was not a writing tradition. There was no writing, as I briefly said earlier, at the time of the Buddha. So it's a little hard for me to imagine a society where everything you had to learn had to be remembered, had to be memorized. You couldn't write it down. Today, I walk around with my mobile phone. It's sort of like a prosthetic device. I could hardly remember anything. But at the time of the Buddha, not only where the Buddha lived, if you wanted to know something, you had to memorize it. You could not write it down. You couldn't make notes. You couldn't look it up in a book later. You couldn't Google it. You simply had to remember it. And so this is a very, I think, important aspect of the Pali language and early Buddhism, which is easy to forget and perhaps hard to grasp fully living in 21st century. So again, Pali was an entirely oral tradition. And so here I would like to mention, so I've mentioned now one idea about Pali, which is that that Pali was the language the Buddha spoke. But other people don't quite agree. And so I'd like to point out briefly, there's a man who I believe is still alive, quite elderly, named K.R. Norman, who has written a lot about what are called Prakrit languages. And he is an expert in Prakrit. He taught, I believe, for many years at Cambridge University. And so I want to read this quote briefly about Sanskrit and Prakrit. So, any movement, whether religious or social, which opposed the power and status of the Brahmanical caste might be expected to make use of a non-Brahmanical language. Not only would this be an anti-Brahmanical gesture, but it would also aid the non-Sanskrit speaking element of the population, i.e., those who spoke a vernacular language. It therefore seems very likely that the Buddhist sermons were preached in a non-Sanskritic language, i.e. a Prakrit, and from the fact that he moved about preaching in various places, we can assume that he preached in a number of dialects, varying his language to suit his audience. And so we see a couple of very interesting things here. We see this interplay of Sanskrit versus what's called Prakrit, and that is the language of the regular people, the vernacular. And perhaps this is most, for at least for Westerners, it's easiest to think about the relationship between Latin and languages like Italian and French and Spanish. That Latin was the language of the church, but the people on the street did not really speak Latin. They spoke vernacular languages, which are called in this context Prakrits. And also he's saying that, of course, it seems to be the case that as the Buddha traveled, as he did quite a bit across northern India, the different people would be speaking different types of languages, probably closely related, but almost certainly not exactly the same. And so he might have had to change what he was saying so his audience would understand him well. And so it's sometimes thought that Pali is sort of an amalgam or a collection of various Prakrits spoken in northern or perhaps northeastern India at the time of the Buddha. And then when they were collected into what we call today the Pali Canon, they were sort of smoothed out. But perhaps it is not an exact representation of what he said, word for word. Of course, we just don't know, and it's impossible to say. But I wanted to mention one more thing, which is a very recent book, which I have found very interesting by a man who has taught Pali and Sanskrit at Oxford University for many years, named Richard Gombrich. He's written several books about Pali and Buddhism. He also teaches Pali. And I don't know if you can see, but he put out this book just a couple of years ago, quite recently, called Buddhism and Pali. And I just wanted to read to you very quickly a couple of phrases or a few sentences from this book. I think he has some interesting things to say. So here on page 78, Buddhism and Pali, Richard Gombrich. The Buddha was continually traveling through a large area of northeastern India, and as he moved from village to village, he had to communicate in a range of dialects. So presumably, he had to work out for his own use something which would serve as a kind of lingua franca. And I add it here as an aside for those who perhaps might not know, the term, this Latin term, lingua franca, refers to a sort of language that is understood by everybody, sort of transnational language. And in Europe, that language was Latin. Okay, we're now returning to the text. The fact that Pali is a little closer to Sanskrit than are the other forms of Middle Indo-Aryan would be the natural outcome of this situation. It could have been developed as years went by, and the early Buddhists were trying to make their text intelligible to a wider geographical area. And I skip to one more section quickly. And then here's Professor Gombrich again. My theory then is that Pali reflects the idiosyncratic language used by the Buddha as he toured Northeast India and communicated with a population ranging from Brahmins to untouchables. When after some years, his followers wrote down what he said and made some attempt to standardize it by giving it a set grammar and an orthography, they were, to some extent, guided by the only grammar and orthography which existed in their culture, those of Sanskrit, but they were also concerned to retain as best as they could the precise characteristics of their teacher's language as preserved by their oral tradition. And so I think what we see here mentioned by Professor Gombrich is that he's saying that the Buddha, in a sense, invented or maybe created, in a sense, a kind of general language reflecting his unique vision. Of course, what today we call Buddhism, it was not called Buddhism at the time of the Buddha. And one of the things which is important to note is that the Buddha himself, a real revolutionary, actually redefined words in the language and gave them rather new meanings, again, to express this new idea about the way things are. And so it became a sort of new language, in a sense, at the time of the Buddha that people were able to understand across various regions. So that is a sort of very quick, as I said, painted in broad strokes, overview of what the language of Pali might be or could be. And so I think I'll set that aside for now. and move on to something else. I seem to have lost, I see. I'm looking for my participant list, but I can't see it. Anyway, I'd like to move, I think I'd like to cover a little bit of what the Pali Canon is, but perhaps not this time. And I'd like to move quickly now to the alphabet of Pali. And so one of the important things to know is that we need to learn a new alphabet, especially as English speakers, as we study Pali. And the good news and the bad news is that the Pali alphabetical order, and in fact, a completely new way of thinking about the way the order is in Pali. It's very similar to Sanskrit. In fact, as an English speaker, I've always wondered about the alphabetical order I learned, the kind of Roman letter alphabetical order. I never quite understood why B came after A, and then C, and then D. Why? What was that order all about? Actually, I've never really gotten an answer. I don't really know. But the good news is that the Pali alphabet, as well as the Sanskrit alphabet, is much better organized. Now, another thing I want to mention also is that, as I've been saying, there was no writing at the time of the Buddha. And so Pali was only written down much later, like hundreds of years later. And so it was written down in the scripts of the places they were written. And so, as Lily de Silva says, in India, they were perhaps written with the Nagari script, but that's eventually. In Sri Lanka, Sinhala script, Burmese script. And in the late 1800s, a group of British people put together a society called the Pali Text Society, and they kind of realized that there was really no reason for them to use Asian scripts, because since Pali had no writing system of its own, this is an important point. Pali does not have its own writing system, but it's rather written in the writing systems of the local people. And so the folks that started the Pali Text Society decided, well, we can just do this with our Roman letters. No problem. Except one catch is that there are actually more sounds represented in Pali than there are in English. Or perhaps I should qualify that by saying they're more precisely notated. It doesn't mean we don't have these sounds at all, maybe, in English, but we don't have specific signs or letters to represent them. So in this sense, the Pali alphabet is more precise. Once you understand how it works, there's much less chance of not understanding how a word should be pronounced, which is certainly not the case with English, which is very often ambiguous. How do we say that? Because so many letters can be interpreted in different ways in English. Not so in Pali. So here we have the letters of the alphabet. This is from, now I should have said, this is from our first book that we're using. This is, I have my old paper copy, which has been taped together now after years of poring over, sort of disintegrating, but I have to say I'm a little bit attached to the paper book. That's my grasping. I need the book. But of course, for the reasons of this online class, we are looking at this PDF file, which is freely, I hope you all have obtained it. It's freely available on the internet, and it was actually posted on BAU's website. So here, and I'll show you another guide too. It tells us that the Pali alphabet consists of 41 letters, 8 vowels, and 33 consonants. And the first thing you might notice is that the vowels in the Pali alphabetical order come first. They have the place of prominence. They're all grouped together, which makes perfect sense. And there are specific values to 3 of them. And so we see here for vowels, what I'm calling, or what is called, short A and long A, short I and long I, short U and long U, and also E and O. And so that bar, that line over the letter, means that it's a long vowel and it has a different sound than the short vowel. So maybe I'll just quickly move over here. And so here we have our very introductory vocabulary. And the first word on the list is manusa, which means a human being. And those are short A's. But for instance, the third word, kumara, notice that the first of the 2 A's is a long A. So that is not kumara. If it was a short A, it might be pronounced kumara. But we have the bar of the A over the A. It's a long A, and so we have kumara, boy. And we'll look at this more and more. Now, the rest of the letters, or perhaps most of the rest of the letters, are grouped into 5 groups, 5 categories. In fact, in Pali, they're called vagga. A vagga could be a chapter, it could be a group, it could be a division, it could be a lot of things. And the 5 are called sometimes gutturals. Gutturals are sometimes called velars, palatals, cerebrals, which are sometimes called, and I prefer the word retroflexed, and I'll explain why in a moment, dentals, and labials. And so what this is saying is that those ingenious ancient people decided that they were going to organize their sounds by the position that the sounds are created in the mouth. And so, and in order of back to front, from the way back in the mouth cavity to the lips. Of course, the lips are the labials. And so at the end, we have the labials, p and b. That is requiring me to press my lips together and sort of explode out a bit of air. And the gutturals way in the back are k, g. And so those are, I can really feel them in the back of my throat. And now another thing to know about Pali letters is that we have what are called aspirated and unaspirated consonants. And these are different. And so, for instance, you can see here clearly that there's K and KH. And KH is actually a letter, one letter. It's not K plus H. And the H is a thing that tells us that it is an aspirate. And so with the H, there's a sort of a puff of air that's released, like the word khanda. So that has a KH. And so if I spelled the word khanda without an H, it would be a spelling error. I need it. Okay. So I want to call up another from the other book that we'll be using, because I think it presents perhaps the alphabet in a slightly more clear fashion, not so jumbled. So this is from the other book that we'll be using, hopefully at the end, towards the end of class, which is Giảng and Karuna Tilaka's book, which is called A New Course in Reading Pali. And this is how they present the alphabet. And perhaps you can read vertically down. So as I mentioned, the gutturals are sometimes called velar. 2 words, the same thing. And cerebrals are sometimes called retroflexed, as they've chosen to do here. So notice that we have a couple of things or several things going on, and don't be too concerned about really wrapping your head around this too much. It's not important really at this point to super memorize the Pali alphabet. What's more important is to understand how the signs or the letters work and how we pronounce them. So as I said, we have aspirates and non-aspirates. And then we have this special column, one of my favorites, called the retroflex, which is always indicated with a dot under the consonant. I hope you can see that. Maybe I'll make it a little bigger. And so, for instance, there is a dental row, which, as you might understand, means produced at the teeth. So the sound t and d and n. And the t with the H, for instance, the country called Thailand. It's not Thailand, as we might think as English speakers. It's an aspirated dental. Thailand. T. My tongue sort of comes right up against the back of my front teeth, and I make that t and d sound. But what looks very similar, but in fact is significantly different, are the retroflex letters, which, as I said, are notated with a dot below. And those mean that the tongue sort of curls back to the soft palate, and sort of, instead of having this t sound, I have my tongue coming back. And so I have a d sound, a d sound. So for instance, there's a verb in Pali, which means to stand, which is called titati, perhaps, but I'm now using the dentals. That's titati with dentals, but in fact, the correct pronunciation and spelling of that verb is with the retroflexed consonants. And so it sounds a bit more like titati. And so it has a sort of distinctive sound, perhaps of India, we might say, which we don't really have so much, sadly, in the West. Titati, duh. Now, just a couple more things before you get completely overwhelmed by this, which is the nasals. And notice that each of the 5 groups have their own nasal. And they're notated in various ways. And here, one is notated with an M with a dot below. The second one of the palatal is notated with an N with a wiggly line on top, sometimes called a tilde. And the retroflex, like the other retroflex consonants, is notated with a dot below, n. And then the n dental, and the labial nasal, m, like mamma mia, m, right at the lips. And then we have, which are sometimes called a resonance, Y, R, L, and V. This is sort of a catch-all area. Venerable Bodhi once told me an easy way to remember this group, Y, R, L, V, is to think of the phrase, your love, which I just love. And so if you remember your love, you'll always remember that Y, R, L, V are in this group in this order. And then we have what are called spirants, which is the S sibilant sound. In Sanskrit, there are 3, but perhaps fortunately for us, there's only one, S. And then we have a couple of miscellaneous, which we don't really have to talk about here too much. And then we have this sort of important, crucial thing, which is called the pure nasal, which sometimes can lead to a little bit of confusion. And it's written in Giảng Kurunatilaka's book with an M with a dot below. But that's unfortunately not the only way that people have chosen how to write it. And if you can see here, I have this sort of scratch pad where I have an M with a dot below, and I have an M with a dot above, and I have this funny looking letter, which doesn't seem like a letter, which looks like an N, the lowercase letter N, with a hook on the right, which kind of looks like a lowercase g. This character is called by linguists and font designers the eng character. And it also represents this same sound, which in Sanskrit is called the anusvara. And what it represents is a kind of what's called a full nasalization of the prior consonant. And so For instance, if I were to say the Pali phrase, which I think you might recognize, Buddhang saranang gacchami. And so here, Buddhang. So at the end, I have this character, ang. It's the nasalization. And saranang, it's the ending we use for the accusative case, which I hope we can get to today. But I have to tell you a couple of things that in this version of Pali Primer, unlike my beloved paper book, which would be less confusing, in this online version, the man who made it decided to notate the Anusvara, which is, I believe, in Pali called the Nigahita, as an N character. That's down here, which is the N with the hook on the bottom or to the right. And I also have to say that he has chosen for the guttural of Velar this weird looking N with a character on the left, which I've never seen anywhere on earth except this book. It's usually written either with an N as an N with a dot above, or as Giảng and Karunatilaka have chosen to do, with the M with the dot below. So the word Sangha has that character, Sangha. That's a guttural nasal. And so I believe in Giảng and Karunatilaka, we would find that letter represented by an N with a dot below, but in many other places we would find it as a N with a dot above. But before your eyes start completely swimming and you feel like you just want to sign off and say, this is just not how I want to spend my summer, I'm ready to move on, because when you look at Pali, you're looking at the alphabet. So we don't have to do too crazy with this, right? And maybe on our next section, I'll tell you all about how one can learn from a technical point of view, although I'm not in any way a computer whiz, how to actually type these letters using your computer, which might be of interest to you. One more thing though, before I leave, because I see it here, is that the letters E and O actually can shift slightly in value, although they don't take a diacritical mark. They don't take a bar ever. So for instance, here we see the word metta. So we'll notice three things about it. Notice the double consonant in metta. And so that means that we have to separate the syllable there. So it is not how perhaps many of my American friends say it, meta. It is not meta, it is metta, because we divide the word there into two syllables. Second of all, notice the long A at the end. Metta, it's a feminine noun. It means loving kindness or loving friendliness or goodwill. Metta, not metta, metta, metta. And the third is that this E, because it's coming right before the double consonant, has this metta. But for instance, in the word deva, D-E-V-A, deva, it's a slightly different sound. It's not deva, deva. So my point is just simply that the single value consonants of E and O can be a little bit adjusted. Deva, Sena, Luka, Odana. Notice here this word soti. Notice that there's not really two T's. There's a T and there's a TH. And remember, as I've said, and I will continue to say, that TH is one letter, one value. It is not, this letter is not spelled, this word is not spelled S-O-T-T-H-I. It's really spelled S-O-T-T-H-I. And we need that H to keep the place for that aspirated consonant, okay? So, putting that aside, and moving to even more fun and exciting things, we're now going to talk a little bit about, which I hope you looked at in advance, the idea in Pali. And by the way, I should say that because we're an online class, I'm afraid I just can't figure out how to work out breaks. So we're just kind of going full steam ahead. We're barreling through, and I just sort of ask for your forbearance, patience, and stamina, because there's so much to cover. And if we were to take breaks, I think we would just kind of lose our momentum. So we'll take a break later at, well, for me it's 9:30. And so what I'd like to do now is talk about the idea of inflection, which I placed upon the Baus website, and I hope you had a look at it. I made this chart a little while ago, a couple of years ago, and it talks about two ideas of declension and conjugation. And I also put here a handy dandy reminder of the Pali alphabet. And notice here I've chosen in the velar group, or the guttural group, to represent that nasal with the N with the dot above. So the word inflection, of course, it's an English word. It comes from the Latin flectere, which means to bend or to change. And an important thing to know about a language like Pali and Sanskrit, as opposed to a language like English, where in English, word order gives a lot of meaning to a sentence. The position of where the words are located in the sentence tell us a lot about the roles those words play within the sentence. Not so much the case with Pali. Although, of course, there is sort of a regular, we can say, order to Pali. But in a language like Pali, there are suffixes primarily, and also something called infixes, things that are sort of plugged into the middle of words, which give them a kind of grammatical sense. So the the syntax of the word is sort of coded into the word. And so we have what's called declension. So those of you who had to do Latin as a young person and maybe have trauma from that, well, we're going to look at that again. I'm sorry. Sometimes I say the word declension to Western people and they sort of shudder and remember horror stories of 5th grade and being forced to recite lists of things they hated. But we can't really learn Pali without understanding the idea of declension. And so in Pali, nouns, adjectives, pronouns, participles, and even numbers are said to be declined. What does that mean? Well, there are 3 things that are part of what's called a declension. The 3 are, they take gender, they take a number, and they take this very important idea of case, which we're going to be talking a lot about in this class, case. So gender is, not surprisingly, can be one of 3 types: masculine, feminine, or neuter. Now, please note that for the vast majority of words, this is a grammatical gender. This is not sort of a sexual gender, but it's just a type of a way to sort of designate a word. But it's important to know the gender because masculine and feminine words are declined differently. They go into different categories or classes. Number in Pali are only 2, unlike Sanskrit should have 3 because there's a dual case in other languages as well. So singular or plural, there should be no problem. And the case, well, in Pali there are 8, and they're presented in various different ways in order. I have here the 8 listed as nominative, accusative, instrumental, ablative, dative, genitive, locative, and vocative. And we're going to have a look at all 8. And we're going to have a look at nominative and accusative today. And maybe I'll even give a quick explanation of instrumental because I want to look at that on Wednesday. So case endings are usually added to the stem form of the word. In Mrs. De Silva's book, she calls this the base, I think. But more typically, this is called the stem. And there are a whole bunch of endings, or I should say perhaps more specifically, groups of nouns which receive their own special set of endings for the cases. And for the most part, we will be looking at in this class what are called the nouns or the words that are ending masculine short A, and they receive one set. But of course, they are the feminine long A, and they receive a different set. And it's important to know that words must take the case endings from which group they come from. So just put that in the back of your head for now. We're not going to get too deeply into that today. Now, the other side of this inflection diagram is conjugation, which for me is probably easier to understand because in English, we don't really do declension. I should mention that I put out on the BAUS website a sort of English language declension guide to help us understand a little bit about declension using English. And I hope you've taken a look at that, and I hope it has been of some use to you. Now, conjugation for verbs take person, number, and tense. Person can be first person, second person, or third person. That's I, we, you, and you all, and he or she or they. What's interesting is that in the Western world, we always think about first, second, and third case person. But traditionally, which we're not going to be really doing in this class, but traditionally in the ancient grammars, third person comes first and first person comes third, which is an interesting way to think about it. Because of course, at least for me, I always think about me first person first. But I think it's just an interesting aside to note that in the ancient grammars, third person, he or she came first and I came third. They just turned it around. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not a great revelation, but it's an interesting perspective. And so for number, we have singular or plural, and then we have tense. And for the most part, we're going to be talking about in this class, present tense. We're not going to have time to talk about other tenses. There's active or passive voice. And I have here that endings are added to the present root or stem, to the root or present stem. So I think at this point, maybe we can try an experiment. If I stop sharing my screen, and we'll see if there are any questions that have arisen up to this point of 45 minutes of my nonstop blabbing. Perhaps a question or a lack of clarity has arisen. So the way to do it, because we have a lot of people, is that we'll have to ask people to use the hand raising feature of Zoom, which I hope you can find on your participant list on the right. And if you do that, sort of a blue hand comes up. And then I will try to unmute you, and then you can ask your question. And I'd just like to say as a ground rule, or a couple of ground rules for our class, is that a question, first of all, should be a question. Please, let's stick to questions and not sort of personal reflections in interest of time. Second of all, the question really should pertain to subjects, to what has been spoken about. And thirdly, please, the question should be quite short. I also will say, if your name is something that looks like Hacker54 or Galaxy92, I ask you to kindly please change that to something that looks like a name, so then I can call on you. So let's try to take I don't know how many questions we'll have time for. Let's see here. I have a hand here for Huang. Are you there? Can you speak, Huang?
I just raised hand at the beginning. Sorry. Yeah, I will raise hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we have Emily. Is that right?
Yes. My question is, can you explain it more about the conjugation side and the person, like a first, second, third? So I think I missed it. I would like to catch.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a lot more about the conjugation when we get to the Lily da Silva book. It's not all I have to say about it. Don't worry. I'll definitely get to that. And if I haven't answered your question in a day or two, please ask this question again, okay?
Okay, right.
Yeah. Any other questions? A surprisingly small number of questions for so much information imparted. No. Okay. Well, then we'll move on. We march on. We'll have a look at Lily da Silva's Pali Primer now in the PDF form. And so let's see, I have to share my screen again somehow. I hope you can all see this. And so we start with lesson 1. And a few things about Pali Primer. A lot of the vocabulary that she has chosen to put in this book seems not so crucial to me. And so I'll probably try to point out things that just don't seem like the most important words for you to spend your Pali career at the beginning memorizing, because you'll maybe never see them again. And so why commit all this stuff to memory? And second of all, we're not going to do that much of Pali Primer here in our class, because in my personal opinion and experience, I've found that Pali Primer has sort of a point where one reaches of diminishing returns, where it gets just a little confusing, and it's maybe best to move on to another book. And so at that point, we'll move on to Ger and Chronotillica. But I think it's important for most people in my experience that we have sort of a slow launch of the cases, because if you've had a look at the beginning of Ger and Chronotillica, you'll find that they just give you all 8 cases right there. Boom. Good luck memorizing it all. And it might be a bit much for a lot of people. And there's also very little explanation as to what these cases mean, which might not be instantly obvious to many. So that is another point about Mrs. Da Silva's book. The third is that the sentences are made up, which is a nice thing, because they're creating a very controlled environment for us with a small vocabulary set. But on the other hand, we are trying to learn Pali to understand how to read what the Buddha said, not a textbook. There's something else I wanted to add about Lily da Silva, which I can't remember right now. And so perhaps I'll just pass on. So here we have an introduction to a very large, and by far the largest group of nouns found in the Pali Canon, or in the Pali language perhaps, which are called the masculine nouns ending in short a. Notice here I call it short a because the letter A has no line over it, which is called long A. And so this is short A. And we have a set of words: Manusa, Brahmana, Kumara, Nara, Putta, Vanija, Kasaka, Matula, Bhupala. I have to say the word Bhupala for king is a rather uncommon word. There's a much more common word for king, which is Raja. The word Bhupala, in a sense, actually, it means literally, it's a combination of the word Bhu and Pala, which means sort of the protector of the earth. Bhumipala. And here we have also what's very interesting, 3 words that are called the Buddha. Buddha, Tathagata, and Sugata. So notice here for the word Buddha, of course, as a kind of clueless American guy, I say Buddha, as we often do here in New York. But if we look at the word closely, it's a short U with a D, and then followed by an aspirated D, written as DH, and then a short A. And so it's probably a little bit more like Buddha, Buddha. So I'm trying to give you a little bit of aspirate in that DH, Buddha. We have Tathagata. The Tathagata, or the word Tathagata, is the word the Buddha very often refers to himself, by. He sort of refers to himself as the Tathagata. The word Tathagata has a very complicated kind of meaning, which we can't really get into here, but it seems like it could either mean thus gone one or thus come one. And the third word here, the third option is the Sugata. That means the well gone one. Gata is related to the verb, which we're going to have in a second. Gachati, which is to go. Gata is a form of that verb. So the well gone one. And then we have some verbs. So notice this very first word, basati, with the long A. So it's not, if it had no bar, if it was a short A, it might be pronounced something like busati. But here it's a long A. Basati. Bunjati. Chindati. Now notice something very important here, that the C sound or the CH sound is usually ch. Chindati. So cuts. So it's not chuts, but in English it's cuts. But in the Pali way of pronouncing letters, it's chindati, cuts. Davati, not so common, run. Now here, notice the C in this word, pachati. Pachati, cooks. Sayati, sleeps. And notice here with this most important verb, there's one verb you remember out of this whole session, it might be this one, gachati, goes. Kasati, plows, not so crucial, but much more important is passati, to see. When we talk about very often in Buddhism, one who knows and one who sees, passati. And then we have the reverse of gachati. Gachati is to go. And then we have a long A placed in front, gachati, which reverses the meaning to come. So gachati is goes, and gachati is comes. Now, I want to mention something briefly, which is very important, is that in English at least, and I think many Western languages, verbs are often given in the dictionary, or they are given in the dictionary in what is called the infinitive. And that's why we say to go, to see, to cut. But in Pali, the verb, is always presented as an entry, so to speak, in the third person singular. So in effect, pachati means he cooks. It doesn't really mean to cook. Sometimes you might hear me say something like that, to cook, because my Western conditioning pops out and I think about dictionary words always being presented in that infinitive form. But in the Pali way of doing things, vocabulary words are vocabulary verbs, like for instance, in the dictionary, are presented in the third person singular. And notice also that the person and number, as I said, third person singular, is coded in a sense or included in the verb. So sayati could be she sleeps, and gachati could be she goes. We don't necessarily need the pronoun. Okay, So this is the way that third person singular verbs are presented. Okay, now we're going to launch, as we see here at number 2, into our declension. So for the nominative case, what is the nominative case? The nominative case is the subject of a sentence or a clause. The doer, the subject, the nominative case. In the nominative case, the case ending of O is added to the nominal base to form nominative case singular. The case ending long A is added to form the plural. And so we have here a few examples. Nura, which is a person. So that is not really any case. It's kind of the stem form or nominal base. So when we plug in an O, or perhaps when we swap the A for an O, we get Nuro, the person. This is the nominative form. Matula is matulo. But, so that's the singular. But if we wanted to talk about more than one person, we couldn't say Naro. We would have to say Nara. So the long A ending swapped for that is telling us plural. Okay, so this is all basically just telling you what's in the book. So maybe we'll look at a few, if I can figure out how to do it, a few examples. I shall want to mention a couple things here. We are not going to be doing in this class English into Pali, which is given second. In this class, we will only be going one way, which is Pali to English. Okay. So Bupalo, I'm here. Bupalo bunjati. So notice we have only 2 words in this sentence. We have a nominative singular, which we can tell by the O ending, and bunjati is the verb. And the verb ending must match the number of the nominative. So since it's one king, bunjati is in the singular. The king is eating, or the king eats. Okay, but for instance, in number 3, Vanija Sayanti, notice first of all that the word Vanija, which means a merchant, has a long A as its suffix. So that's plural. So we're talking about merchants here. Yes? Vanija, merchants. And so therefore, the verb has to match the number. And so we add this N. So notice it's not sayati anymore, it's sayanti. So the verb takes the plural. Merchants sleep or lie down. And going back to singular, Kumaro Davati. Notice there's no N here. But I want to move quickly now to accusative and then take them both sort of as a group. Okay, so the accusative case, which is the other case we'll be covering today, is the object of the verb. I see we have a question, but let me just do this quickly. The accusative case is the object of the verb. So if I said in English, Stephen sees Mark, the subject of the sentence is Stephen. Stephen might be said to be in the nominative case. The verb is sees, and the direct object of the verb is Mark, which we might say is in the accusative case. But notice that in English, I haven't changed Mark. I could actually say Mark sees Stephen without changing those words at all. And so as I said, in English, word order is extremely important, because the sentence Stephen sees Mark is a very different sentence than Mark sees Stephen. But in Pali, the subject and the object contain in their words their role, the role that they're playing in the sentence. Okay, so also notice that in this English sentence I've given you, the verb is in the middle, but very often in Pali, the verb will come at the end. So it's a slightly different verb order. We'll see this. And so in Pali, it would probably be expressed more like Stephen Mark sees. We'll see this. Now, and for the accusative case, the direct object of the verb takes this eng, ung, full nasalization character, which I told you about how it can be written down in these various ways. And I mentioned how in this version of the book, it is written by this eng character that looks like an N with a G stem. So we take our word, nara. This is the stem form, or as she's calling it, the base. And we swap the A with the ung. And then we get narang. And this is the accusative singular way. Matula in the accusative singular is matulang. Kasaka, farmer, but in the accusative singular, kasakang. But in the plural, it's a little different. And so if the direct, suppose if I wanted to say Stephen sees people or Stephen sees uncles, that pluralization is notated with a a E ending. So nare and matule and kasake. And so we have here accusative case and singular and plural. Oop. I've moved on to section 3 unwillingly. How do I get back? Okay. So here, if I can get it to show you, this example sentence, which I've now highlighted in blue, Putto narang pasati, which translates to the sun sees the man. Putto narang pasati. So notice here two things, or several things. First of all, the verb is at the end in the singular because there's no N there. And notice that it's matching the first word, which is the nominative singular, putto. And then the object of the verb is narang. So putto means a sun, singular, nominative, singular. The verb is pasati. It's in the present tense, singular, matching putto. But what is the sun seeing? What is the object of the seeing? It's narang. So notice here that that object of the verb, which what we're calling the accusative case, has that ung ending. So it's not putto naro pasati. It's putto narang pasati because the sun sees the man. Who is the sun seeing? He is seeing narang, the man. And so that's how we know who's the seer and who is being seen, for instance. And similarly, in the second sentence, Brahmano matulang rakkati. So notice again, the first word, Brahmano, is with the O suffix, nominative singular, the Brahman. The verb again is at the end of the sentence, rakkati. It's to protect. And what is being protected? Matulang. So again, we have that ang suffix. It's the uncle. It's the direct object of the verb. Okay, so maybe we can quickly go to a few examples if I can manage my file. Or maybe we should even take a question. Are there any questions about this declension and noun forming so far? I see a question from Surya Kumar.
Yeah, what's the difference between normative and accusative? How do you differentiate those two things, actually? I don't understand that.
Okay, the nominative case is used for the subject of the sentence. It denotes this action doer. So if I say, Stephen teaches Pali, the subject of the sentence is Stephen. I'm the doer. I am the one who's teaching. And so we might say, I'm the nominative case person. What is the object of what I'm teaching? Stephen teaches what? Stephen teaches Pali. And so the object of that verb is Pali, and that is expressed in the accusative case. It's the object of the verb. I hope that at least starts to answer your question. And then I think we have one more question from Emily.
Yes, Stephen. My seeing it is the sentence structure is as like a subject object verb.
Yes, that's correct. Often the case.
Okay.
Okay. Let's go back and do a couple more polyprimer examples. I wonder how I can do this where I can see the screen and see the list of participants. I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, I see here. Okay, so maybe we can have a volunteer. Generally what we'll do is in the chapters that have even numbers, we'll take the even numbered examples, and the chapters that have odd number chapters, we'll take the odd numbered examples or questions. So here we're in chapter 2, but we'll maybe start with the first one. So is there someone who'd like to volunteer to read the first sentence, which I've just put in blue, and give us a translation? So Huang?
Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, there's a huge amount of echo. Are you between two devices?
Yeah, hold on.
Are you there?
Yes.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of echo. You seem to have two speakers going simultaneously.
Can you hear me now?
That's much better, yes. Can you go ahead with the first one?
Tathagato Dhammang Vasati.
Mm-hmm.
And the Buddha Vasati is speaks Dhammang, Dharma.
That's
The
right.
Dharma.
Very good. So here we have the subject, the nominative case, the word Tathagato, the doer, and he is speaking. He speaks. And what is he speaking? What is the direct object of the verb? It's Dhammang. Yes, perfect. Is there anyone else who'd like to try doing a sentence? Somebody who hasn't gone before? Pat, okay. Pat, are you there?
Yep, here I am.
Okay, would you mind doing number 3?
Oh dear, yes. What have I gotten myself into? Okay, so it says Manuso Suryang Passati.
Yes.
So Manuso would be a person,
Nominative case.
I will get back to Suryang in just a second. Pasati is sees,
Yeah.
and I'm going to have to desperately look for the word.
Well, just tell me what case.
It's an accusative.
Yes, it's the
Singular.
accusative.
Yeah.
And it's the sun.
Oh, the sun. Okay. I was thinking of the word putta for sun, but
No, it's this S-U-N. Sorry, the star.
oh, the sun.
Not a
different
child.
sun. Yeah. Okay. So the man sees, or the person sees the sun.
Right. Okay. And maybe you could have one more. We have one more person here. Surya Kumar. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Can you do for us, say number 5?
Yachaka batang yachanti means yachaka.
Tell me the case and number for the first word. What case and what number?
Yachaka is the nominative case.
And is it plural?
Yeah, it's plural. I think.
It's plural because we have the long A.
Yeah, long A.
And notice that the verb yachanti has that N, so it's plural too.
Yeah.
So beggars beg, and then this middle word, batang, what case is that? It's not nominative.
Okay.
It's the only other case we've done. It's accusative.
Accusative, yeah.
It's the object of the verb. So beggars beg for rice.
Okay.
So
means rice, huh?
yes, or it could be food perhaps, but here I think it's given as rice.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. All right, we're almost out of time. I wanted to try to talk a little bit about, first of all, I would like to say for those here, if you'd like to continue with this class, please do all the exercises in these first 2 chapters, both to get yourself familiarized with the vocabulary and familiarized with the case endings. And it's more important that you start to recognize the cases than the vocabulary. The lexical meaning, so to speak, is less important than the part of speech. So when we see a word ending in O like that, we just know, nominative singular, that's the subject. And we have a word ending in the ong, we know it's, for instance, accusative singular. Yeah. So please do that. And I'd like to we'll do a little bit of that on Wednesday together. And then we are going on to instrumental case, at least. And perhaps even the next one. Which I can't see, but we'll do the next 2 chapters. So please prepare ablative. Yeah. So we will start to cover instrumental and ablative for Wednesday. And then of course we'll have a longer break until the following week to sort of catch your breath. But my plan is to try to cover 2 cases per class. Okay. So are there any final questions about anything that has been covered in this session that I have not made clear? No questions at all. I'm starting to think very highly of my teaching, but I'm very suspicious. I think that's not quite the case. Pat, did you just raise your hand? Do you have one last question for us?
Yeah, just a quick question. I was wondering, is there some place that we can communicate with each other online? Is there a Facebook or something like that? Or is that?
It's not something it's a little bit out of our scope, I'm afraid.
Fair enough.
But
Just asking.
we will communicate here, hopefully.
Okay, thanks.
And one final question from Kam Savath.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for this workbook. Do we have answers to all of these Pali words that we can check if we do the answer correctly?
Well, you're welcome to ask me. There is a book published. I don't know if it's available online, sort of like The Answer Key, which I do have, because sometimes in the later chapters, these sentences get a little obscure, but not that I know of immediately. Perhaps if you search online, you might find one. But if you have any questions about your homework, you can certainly ask me on Wednesday, okay? All right. Well, thank you all very much for your extreme patience with this very big subject. I hope I've started to make some inroads of clarity. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with an avalanche of information where you're starting to just feel like you want to give up. Please don't. I can tell you from personal experience that the key to learning Pali is not brilliance, at least not in my case, but it is persistence. And so I'm not a Pali expert. I'm much more of a Pali enthusiast because this language is very dear to me and I love it. And that's why I'm willing to devote so much time to it and tell other people about it. And so through persistence and patience, which are, by the way, kind of important Buddhist attributes, we can learn quite a bit about Pali. So thank you all very much for your time. I look forward to seeing you all again on Wednesday at this time. Hopefully this class has been recorded and live streamed on YouTube and will be available on YouTube. I don't know, maybe you want to look at it again, maybe not. If there are things I've said wrong, you can tell me all about it on Wednesday. Okay, thank you all and have a great day. Bye-bye.